разные годы
Throughout
разные
the
люди
years, many
ездили.
people frequently traveled around the world in search of evidence of advanced ancient civilizations. Starting in 2004, we formed an assembly of established scientists of many disciplines, who decided to take a look at the various ancient artifacts with their own eyes, and judge them from their own scientific point of view. Initially, of course, there was a question which they all wanted to answer. And this is a question which interests a lot of people, and they always argue about this. And that is, could the ancient Egyptians, being a relatively primitive society as we imagine them to be, in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, have built the pyramids of Giza? There are all sorts of arguments being made about it. Some talk about the number of workers needed for construction, while others estimate the size of the blocks of stone and whether they could have transported them or not. All these disagreements make us feel as if we're running in circles, because some people use certain numbers to prove that it was impossible for the ancient Egyptians to have built them, while others try to use the very same numbers, along with some of their own, to try to prove the complete opposite, and say that it was indeed the work of ancient Egyptians. So this is where we all seem to be running in circles, and frankly, it's getting a little annoying. Actually, at first, we too were interested in the answer to this question, but as a result, I think that we found a much better direction to head into. And this direction is simply this. If we look at the famous Great Pyramid over there on the right, its weight is roughly 7 to 8 million tons. The second pyramid is a bit smaller, however, combined, the 3 pyramids in Giza weigh in excess of 15 to 20 million tons, all made out of stone. So what is 1 million tons of stone? Well, somebody had to shape and transport the stone blocks to the building site. But first let's talk about the fact that they had to be shaped somehow. If we consider the weight of all the megalithic constructions found on our planet, then we will get a figure in the vicinity of hundreds of millions, possibly even billions of tons. Those are quite substantial figures. So we're talking about a colossal effort in construction and stone fabrication. Subsequently, when a construction is done on such an enormous scale, no one will ever be able to make everything perfect and flawless. And in many cases, being perfect is not even required, with techniques like polishing and etc. So there are certain undesired flaws in construction which remain, some kind of traces of craftsmanship, including the marks left by the tools which were used. Furthermore, it's just a matter of simple logic. I mean, any person can deduce if a piece of wood was carved by a knife, cut by a saw, or simply broken off by hand. And after each of these methods, a specific trail of clues is left, which tells us something about the method which was used. Same thing with stone. We have to consider the specific attributes of the stone. And we also have to take into account the laws of physics. Here's a bit of physics for those who are not familiar with it. This graph shows the hardness of various materials. This is something they might teach you in school in natural science class. So what we're talking about here is that if we try to process a hard material using a tool made out of a relatively softer material, then all we'll achieve is the dulling of the tool itself. In other words, it's impossible to work with basalt or granite using copper. That is, using copper alone. You must always use some kind of an additional element or an abrasive, like quartz sand, or something that's harder than granite. So in any case, the work would not be done by the copper tool alone, but by the sand or a relatively harder material. So this is a simple occurrence which we must take into account. Here's a good example of two vastly different types of stonework on a block of black basalt. On the right side, the stone was processed by a hand tool, using a simple method of chiseling. On the left, we have the stonework resulting from a machine fabrication. This conclusion is drawn from the fact that as a result of using a chisel on the surface, it becomes rough and uneven. In addition, the stone actually changed color, becoming whiter. In order to achieve the surface which we see on the left, we would need to have some kind of a very fast-moving instrument. So probably it was a disc-type saw rotating at a very high speed, and not only cutting the stone but also polishing it as well. In addition, here we also have a trace of the very same instrument, which kind of veered off to the side and left this crease. This is a classic example, which might as well be included in the modern textbooks on stoneworking, sort of showing the picture with the effect of a certain tool on a piece of material. Were it not for one small detail, this block actually lies near one of the smaller pyramids, near the larger pyramid of Pepi II in southern Saqqara. Pepi II is considered to be the pharaoh of the 5th dynasty, dating all the way back to the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. So we're talking about machine-based stone fabrication over 5,500 years ago. So we mostly concentrated our efforts on these types of finds. You may have seen something similar to this earlier today on the floor made out of black basalt. Here you can see that the width of the blade which cut this block of granite is about 2 to 3 millimeters, or about 1/10 of an inch. And here you can see the incremental notches left by the saw. This is a block which also lies near the Great Pyramid, and judging by the distance between the notches, the saw progressed at a step of about 1 millimeter, or about 1/25 of an inch. This is not easy to accomplish, using even the modern equipment, if it was in fact a flat-edge saw which was used here. So when we talk about machine tools, what we're really talking about is a diamond-tipped cutting blade on a steel base. We're talking about a technology which was clearly out of reach for ancient Egyptians. Here's something you may have seen earlier today on your trip. This is sort of a chopping block which was used as a base to cut other stones on. When the stone was cut, the saw went further and made these chaotic incisions on the block below it. If you were to cut this stone using a hand tool, then once the stone is split, there's no reason to cut any further. So this instrument was moved automatically and with a very high velocity. So it was clearly not something done by hand. Here's the sarcophagus in the Cairo Museum. It was placed deliberately with its back towards the wall because it's unfinished on that side. If you look closer, or maybe shine a flashlight at it, then you can see the same notches we saw earlier. These two notches run in different directions, almost perpendicular to one another. Again, this was cut by some kind of a saw which progressed with a step of 1 millimeter, or about 1/25 of an inch. So actually, this would test the limits of even the current stone manufacturing methods. And I don't know if anybody noticed that floor made out of black basalt near the Great Pyramid. There it's evident that many of the cuts on it were made chaotically. It almost seems like a welder testing his electrode on some kind of a piece of scrap material. He touches it with the electrode, and a bit of weld remains there. Same thing here. Somebody made this with a single swing of the tool. There's no meaning behind it whatsoever. But you can see that this cut was literally made in 1 or 2 motions. So each cut is a result of a single movement of the saw. Using current technology, a cut like this could possibly be made using a huge circular saw. This is a block of red porphyry located in Abydos in the world-famous Osirian. It is about 6 to 7 meters in length, or about 20 to 23 feet. So you can imagine the size of a flat-edge saw which was used to cut something like this block. The saw would have to be over 10 meters or 33 feet long just to achieve the swing needed to cut this block. Clearly no copper or bronze tool could be used here, since it wouldn't maintain its stability at that size. Here we see that they sawed this block up until the line a bit below the top and then broke the rest of it off. Almost identical results can be achieved in modern times when we see a stone cut in the modern stone cutting facilities using a disc-shaped saw. The saw is spun and then is passed horizontally, leaving a horizontal cut mark. Furthermore, our modern blades only advance with an increment of 2 or 3 millimeters, or about 1/10 of an inch, max, so as not to overload the saw. So, if it was in fact a disc-based saw which was used, then we're talking about a saw with a minimum diameter of 2.5 meters, or 8.2 feet. The maximum diameter of a modern disc stone cutting blade is 3 meters, or 9.8 feet. Anything larger would compromise the steel disc. The diamond tips on it wear off constantly and must always be replaced. But more importantly, the steel disc can't withstand the load. We currently don't have any material which could withstand the load exerted upon it from such a cut. These are all ancient objects. No one has touched them, cut, or drilled them in any way using any kind of modern equipment. This is a granite block in Abu Rabash. Here you can see the cuts made by a saw which accidentally made a small detour. So if it was cut with a flat saw, then the saw would have moved like this. But actually this block was curved throughout its surface on both top and bottom. So ideally it could have been made by the same type of saw, of about 1.5 to 2 meters or 5 to 6.5 feet in diameter, as was explained to us by the lead foreman at the modern stoneworking facility. Or it could also have been done by a pendulum-type saw. However, given the radius of the cut, we would have to suspend the pendulum saw at a height of 10 meters or 33 feet, a fairly substantial distance. So what makes up a disc saw? Well, it's the mechanisms which rotate the disc. Also, the energy must be supplied from somewhere to facilitate the rotation. So, in other words, disc-type saws are really a result of advanced modern machine-based manufacturing. This is the back of a sarcophagus in Saqqara. What looks to be like a very negligently done work, with some kind of a tool that's similar to a handheld grinder. Here's another mark left by a disc saw, also in Saqqara near the Usarkaf pyramid. So this disc would have been about 40 centimeters or 16 inches in diameter. This is a block in Abusir, in an area which is currently closed off to tourists. Here you could see a cut which runs along the top of the block. This is a continuous single cut, and it looks like this. It shows that this cut was practically made with one single swing of the saw, and then the rest of it was just broken off. And not only was this cut at a curve, but this cut is at its deepest at about 13 to 14 centimeters, or about 5.5 inches. Again, it seems as if something like a portable grinder was used here. But to cut such a hard material as this black basalt using a modern handheld grinder, the worker would only be able to cut at a depth of 1 to 1.5 millimeters, or 1/25 of an inch, in one single pass of the blade. So what kind of a material was this tool made out of? And what kind of strength must this craftsman have possessed in order to apply such an unbelievable amount of force on this tool? So actually, this kind of cut is out of reach of our modern stone fabrication methods. This is in Karnak, seemingly showing some ordinary decorative grooves which run alongside the pictograms. Again, you get a sense of something like a portable grinder was used to cut these grooves. These are granite gates. Most tourists pass through them when visiting this site. The height of this gate structure is about 5 to 6 meters, or about 16 to 20 feet. This groove spans the entire height of the monument, and there are similar ones near it as well. The other side of the gates has the same types of grooves, and this is what one of them looks like close up. The depth of this cut is about 1 centimeter, or about 2/5 of an inch, at times maybe more. Basically, this is a V-shaped cut with a width of about 3 to 4 millimeters, or about 3/20 of an inch, on entry at the top, and practically 0 width at the bottom. It's about 1/10 of a millimeter, or maybe 1/250th of an inch. Not a single one of our modern materials, which we use for cutting, can withstand the load exerted upon it, given the similar circumstance of working with granite like this. In other words, we can't even imagine what this tool could have been made out of. Here we see the same grooves but a bit further down. The width of this cutting blade was about 1 to 2/10 of a millimeter, or about a 250th of an inch. For a comparison, a blade on a modern type disc saw can't be wider than 1 centimeter, or about 2/5 of an inch. Yes, that's 1 centimeter. Well, you could, if you were also using an abrasive material, and then this blade would self-sharpen and you would get an oval wedge tip as a result of grinding down. But it's still a minimum of several millimeters in width. Anything smaller would break the saw. We found these discs on display at the Cairo Museum. I'm not sure if we'll encounter them again because they were removed from the exhibition for a while. They are stone discs, similar to our modern CDs, maybe a bit thicker, and a hole in the center, made from all kinds of stone. As the photograph near their display tells us, they were supposedly found alongside some wooden arrows. In order to produce one of these discs, you would need to have access to modern machinery, something like a lathe. Here's yet another example of machine fabrication. This one's done by a tube drill. This was not drilled with a solid drill bit, but specifically a tube-shaped one. The drill proceeds to a certain depth, and then the tube is removed. The remaining central core is then given a good bump from the side and breaks off from the rest of the stone at its base. This is a very convenient method of drilling, whether on granite or black basalt. Actually, the core doesn't break right at the base, but a few millimeters away from the end of the cut. And you can see some interesting parameters as a result of that. Here I'll talk about some other parameters. We see the notches left by a drill, and you can see that they're regularly spaced in increments of 1 millimeter, or about 1/25 of an inch. From this, we can draw a conclusion that the drill progressed with 1 whole millimeter, or 1/25th of an inch, in a single rotation. Over 100 years ago, when Flinders Petrie, a famous Egyptologist, encountered the same problem, he considered it precisely as that, a problem. Back then, it surpassed the stone manufacturing capabilities of the day by a factor of 1,000. Today, of course, we've caught up, and are now capable of much more. But nonetheless, in order for the drill bit to advance to a depth of 1 millimeter or 1/25th of an inch, there needs to be a high velocity of rotation, at a minimum of tens or even hundreds of revolutions. So this, in fact, is much more powerful than even the current technology which we have. You can see them in Saqqara as well. This is in Karnak. Here you can see a tube-like drill used with a diameter of roughly 20 centimeters or 8 inches. Here you could see the cut made by the tip of the tube drill. There's a bit of core remaining, resulting from it being not completely broken off at the base. So you can see that the thickness of the blade tip was about a millimeter or 1/25th of an inch, given a 20 centimeter or an 8-inch diameter of the overall tube. This is an area which is closed off to tourists, also in Karnak. There's an overpass with a similar drill hole in the ceiling of about 60 to 70 centimeters, or about 2 feet in diameter. For a comparison, modern fabrication equipment which could cut granite like this was first mass-produced in Czechoslovakia around the end of 1980s to early 1990s, if I remember correctly. But then again, we're talking about a diamond attachment to a tube made out of steel. Here is a small and seemingly insignificant hole made in the granite block of the obelisk at Karnak. The hole, which has a depth of about 10 centimeters, or about 4 inches, and it is cut at an angle of about 15 to 20 degrees from the horizontal. Those of you who've ever worked with a drill could imagine what it's like to try to force that drill into a concrete wall using a single swing. The drill starts to go sideways. Meanwhile, there are no signs that any kind of hammering took place here, and the drill just entered this granite as if it was packing foam or some kind of soft wood. Furthermore, it could enter this material at any angle. The purpose of these holes is actually to hold a decorative panel, maybe made out of gold or copper. Today we would drill holes like this in a wall for a screw or an anchor to be inserted into it. So this hole serves a very similar function, however it was drilled in a very hard material. This photograph was taken at the Serapeum in Saqqara. Visitors are not allowed in this area. These are some boxes. There are about 20 of them there. The total weight of one of these things, including the lid, is estimated to be 100 tons. This box is monolithic, meaning that it's all made from one single piece of stone. Not too long ago, Christopher Dunn conducted the following experiment. He didn't give a reason, just wanted to try it. He tried to get a similar box manufactured using modern equipment, and he even sent out requests to stone manufacturing facilities throughout the United States. He was told that yes, we can make something like this, but only from 5 separate parts. In other words, the bottom and the 5 walls, and that at the present time, making it monolithic is beyond their ability. Meanwhile, this was all under the assumption that money was no object, so not a single modern company took up this challenge of making a box like this out of a monolithic piece of stone. Aside from that, you can judge the quality of craftsmanship for yourself by the presence of a near mirror-like reflection on the bottom of the lid of the sarcophagus. Another problem arises when trying to date the sarcophagus. The ornamental etchings and writings seen here attribute the sarcophagus to the New Kingdom, or only about 3,000 years ago. Clearly, you could see that the writing here is made on top of a previously damaged area. If we visit the Cairo Museum, then you will see a whole row of these sarcophaguses where old damaged areas were not completely polished off and are actually visible. And the writing runs on top of those damaged areas, which is clear evidence that the writing was applied much later than the actual production date of the sarcophagus. So you can't really establish the age of the sarcophagus just by looking at the writing on it. You can only say for certain that the sarcophagus already existed at the time, but for how many years it existed is impossible to say. This is something we could see in Dashur. These are pieces of a sarcophagus, thought to be made out of quartzite, but evidently there is no pure quartzite in Egypt, and so this is half quartzite. Basically an undercooked sandstone, not quite quartzite. In other words, a more easily workable material, but still. And with these pieces of a sarcophagus, we're dealing with interior angles made using 3 planar surfaces. Not a single modern stoneworking plant is capable of making these kinds of angles. When we consulted with the people who were developing a laser at a research facility in Troysk, near Moscow, they said that yes, you could do this with a laser, but you would need to have a power generator that is half the size of this room, and that is only to supply the energy needed. I'm gonna jump ahead a bit and say that we didn't discover any signs that they were using a laser on these blocks. The use of a laser results in some melted material being left there, if only a little bit. There were no traces of any melting here. Furthermore, not only were they able to cut such complex interior angles, but they also removed a layer from the surface of the stone. This was the bottom of the sarcophagus, and this was done so that the corners would not be damaged too much during transportation. Another thing which resembles modern machining methods is found here in the Aswan quarry. There are these pits which were supposedly used to check the stone for cracks. You can only fit in them if your arms are folded along your sides, so they're only about 60 to 70 centimeters or about 2 feet in diameter. At the same time, some of these pits are 6 meters or 20 feet deep. When somebody tries to prove that these pits were dug using hammerstones, I don't know. Can you imagine the worker who was held by his legs, and as he lifted the hammerstone to his face, and then dropped it, and this was somehow supposed to have crushed something? It's unthinkable that he would go down 6 meters or 20 feet in this manner, while also somehow achieving seemingly polished walls. This looks to be the work of some kind of a funny-shaped drill. There are about 20 or 30 of these pits on that site. They could have been done using some kind of a semi-cylindrical, maybe an oval-shaped instrument, which was also probably used to carve out the famous obelisk, where the stone was removed along its sides in this manner. In fact, there was so much excess material removed from the sides that it seemingly wasn't that much of an effort for them. Doing this work without machine-type instruments is very difficult to imagine. Here's an area in the same quarry which was recently opened to visitors. You could see a block which was probably used to make some kind of a statue. As we learn from our textbooks, to carve out a stone block, the material needs to be removed on the sides and the bottom, and then we use a wedge to break off the central piece. Not here. This material was also extracted. Here, the regularly extracted areas are also polished on the surface. Not the kind of surface which results from chipping away at the material, but one which was deliberately polished. This was sort of a side effect of their instrument that they used. This is something we can see in Sakra. It's a series of very level floors. This gives an impression that they were leveled like we would polish our wooden floors. In other words, after the blocks were laid down. There's a similar floor made out of limestone in southern Sakra. This one here spans about 6 to 7 meters, or 20 to 23 feet in length. And on the edges, you could see that this was a single block, which had about 7 to 8 centimeters, or about 3 inches removed from the top. In other words, first they laid down the blocks, and then they straightened them out wherever they needed. As a side effect of their work, the limestone actually changed color on its surface to a depth of about 1 centimeter or 2/5 of an inch. What was this a reaction to? Maybe some kind of a chemical or temperature-based influence? There are many possibilities here. If this was a chemical, then the question is, what did they spill on it? If it was temperature-based, then the question is, how fast was the tool moving in order to change the color of the limestone to such a depth? And here we are in the Aswan quarry again. And this is a vertical wall. Here you could see some people so you can get a sense of scale. You could see that the wall is about 2 to 3 stories tall. The wall was simply a result of material being removed. It runs to this corner and then curves at a perfect radius of about a half a meter or 1.6 feet at an angle of 90 degrees and then curves again. When we consulted with a lead technologist at a stoneworking facility, he said that something similar could be accomplished using a plasma burner, working with a temperature of about 1,000 degrees Celsius or 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. And this would have to be a directed effort. In other words, it would be done on purpose. But here, you could see that this is simply being a side effect from some kind of an instrument. Here you can see how the stone masters laid a block in Abydos in Assyrian. The block extended into the neighboring wall, and then they cut off that side of the block and somehow straightened it out on the surface. This block is about 1.5 meters or 5 feet in height. We saw this earlier today at the Granite Temple, where seemingly you have blocks which wrap around the corners and enter into the neighboring wall. This effect is easy to achieve. Of course, easy is only a relative term. That is, if you have an instrument which can take off a significant portion of the top layer of the stone. You lay the stone unevenly and then you remove about 10 centimeters or 4 inches from the top. At the present time, we don't have any kind of technology needed to accomplish something like this. And since time is running out, I won't focus too much on the smaller objects found in the Cairo Museum. But marks left by a disc saw were also discovered in Syria, signs that a column in Lebanon and a similar one like it in Abydos were produced in a lathe or some kind of a spinning machine. Here I'll show a couple of small objects that we found in Mexico. These are something similar to small spools from a sewing machine. Actually, the largest of these objects are the size of a sewing machine spool. You can imagine a small spool which is used to collect some thread. This is made from obsidian, which is volcanic glass. The idea that Indians, who didn't even have the wheel, would be working with something which could only be made using a mechanical lathe, and they cut it. Obsidian is easy to work with when it's chipped, and here we see that it was actually cut. It has a hardness of 5. Again, you have to use something like a corund or a diamond. Sure, they could have used these for ritual purposes, slicing their lower lip and using it as a stud for decoration. Well, if you give an Aborigines a ballpoint pen, and he uses it as a nose ornament instead of a stick, does that mean he actually manufactured the pen? And this little object is even smaller and made from mountain crystal. The only way to work mountain crystal is by using a diamond. These objects are a bit larger, about 5 to 6 centimeters or about 2.5 inches in diameter. Maybe used as some kind of a plug, but I can't imagine the purpose they must have had. They're also made from obsidian. Here is something else made from obsidian. Again, I can't imagine what the function of it was. My best guess is it could have been a ferrule of some kind for a mechanism. But why did it have to be made out of obsidian? And near it we have some common objects. Knives, chisels, all made from the same obsidian. They wanted us to see that it was all found together. Here we have a small tube made out of nephrite. The thickness of its walls is only about 1.5 to 2 millimeters, or about 2/25 of an inch. And it's drilled all the way through. It is completely hollow in the center. So again, what was used to make it? If it was made with one of their primitive hand tools, I can't even imagine. However, when we attribute this to machine manufacturing, then everything falls into place. And of course the most killer evidence is in Peru and Bolivia. So here you have huge blocks cut out of a mountain, which were then transported anywhere they wanted and shaped however they wanted. Here's a wall made using a polygonal stoneworking method in Ollantaytambo in Peru. Here a wall is embedded into a side of a mountain, which makes the structure very seismically stable, and it moves with the mountain in the event of an earthquake. These blocks weigh over 400 tons each and were actually raised to a height of 600 meters, or about 1900 feet. And they were placed in such a way that there are no spaces at all between them and the decorative inserts. And subsequently, there are other walls there as well. And you could see that after some kind of a demolition occurred, these blocks were inadequately repositioned, and the space between them was filled with common unshaped rocks and clay mortar. So it's immediately clear that the rough unshaped rocks, along with the mortar, is the work of the Incas. There's no question about that. But then the question arises, who made those structures before them? And the thing about Peru and Bolivia is this. If in Egypt, we may have some things which could be said were in transition in terms of technology, and there are quite a few disputed issues, here the picture is very clear. Here we see the bottom layer, made using a highly technologically advanced method of stone fabrication, that is exceptionally laid together, while not using any mortar, and the top is what was done by the Incas. Sure, they reused the blocks from some other construction, and they used whatever material they could find. This is a vertical mountain where all kinds of niches, steps, and shelves were cut into it. In other words, they did whatever they liked with the mountain. Here's a monolithic construction which is actually a part of the mountain, and this piece near it was carved from another place and just inserted there. Meanwhile, the amount of effort to do this would have been incredible even using the modern equipment. What the reason behind it was, that is unknown. The only thing you could possibly fit in one of these niches is maybe a book or a small bottle, that's all. And a bit to the left of that, there's a kind of a platform surface, which Alexander Dimnikov from our expedition is seen here photographing. There's an oval shape cut vertically out of a mountain, and the resulting surface is also polished from the cut. And below, you can see a sort of a net-like pattern cut into the base. The function was possibly to prevent someone from slipping on the surface if it was raining. You could see something like this on the steps of the subway in Moscow, where they just pass through the surface with something like a portable grinder with a diamond-tipped disc. And here we see that it was cut, and not only that, it was a dual cut, using a blade with a thickness of only about a millimeter, or about 1/25 of an inch. Here's a mark left by a disc saw in Sacsayhuaman. There are very clearly evident traces which were left by a disc-shaped saw. No other kind of instrument comes to mind. We're clearly not dealing with any Incas here, with their primitive bronze tools. And right near it is about a centimeter or 2/5 of an inch deep groove cut into the mountain. This groove spans a whopping 10 meters or 33 feet across, very similar to when we work with something like glass or ceramics, when we score the glass and then break off the rest of it by applying a bit of force. But here it was done on the mountain, and the piece that broke off weighs several hundred tons. Again, here you see the instrument entering the material at a depth of 1 to 1.5 centimeters, or about 2/5 of an inch, using a seemingly single motion. As I mentioned before, even working with a modern tool, like a portable grinder, it would only be able to cut into something as hard as this diorite by about a millimeter, which is about 1/25 of an inch. Here you could see how deep all this is, and you could see the piece which broke away from the mountain below. Here's one of their other creations, those who could work with a mountain like this. This is all granite, local andesite. This is in Pumapunku, Bolivia. The color and shape of these blocks give an impression that they're made out of concrete, but actually it's just local andesite. Here in Bolivia we're in luck because many of the things are buried for a long time and were only recently unearthed by the archaeologists. Therefore all the sharp interior angles cut into many of the blocks found here retained their perfect original shape, since they were not damaged by any elements. This is actually work on the master level, and modern stoneworking professionals are baffled by how this was done. We're clearly not talking about any kind of primitive tools being used here. This is something fabricated using a machine, and furthermore, in many cases using technology which greatly surpasses our own. Take a look. Here we have an interior angle made out of 3 plane surfaces. This is one of the cases which proves that this was not concrete, but actually a result of a mechanical cut on a natural stone material. A hard fragment of stone which was cut off along with the rest of the material. If it was made using a concrete mold, then this fragment would simply just sink below the surface, and we wouldn't see it. Here's another example of clear signs left by a machine-type fabrication. On the other side of the small block, there is a vertical groove into which a series of holes were drilled. These holes are roughly 2 to 3 millimeters, or 1/10 of an inch, in diameter. Why they were drilled, it's unclear. This was done by masters of stonework, with seemingly little effort. Here's another block. There are rows of holes in this block, going every which way. Here they split up, one goes down, the other one goes this way, and these 2 grooves on top actually approach zero at the edges. So again, some kind of a disc-shaped instrument was used to make these grooves, something which could easily cut granite like this. This is a classic example from Machu Picchu. Considered by mainstream archaeologists to be a tomb of some leader, it was actually empty when it was discovered, looking a bit like our modern sauna. Here's a natural side of the mountain, and these embedded blocks give an impression that they're made out of some kind of a soft clay or plastiline. Here we initially thought that the front portion of this block was sawed off. However, when we look closer at the edge of the cut, it almost seems as if they used some kind of a wide screwdriver and poked the stone and then broke off the rest by hand. In other words, as if they were working with some kind of a semi-soft clay material. And on this block, this darker portion is about a millimeter or about a 1/25 of an inch deeper than the more yellow section above it. It gives an impression as if this layer was actually removed by hand. These are technologies which are not only a mystery as to how this was done, but also the chemical and the physical processes by which this granite was shaped are completely unknown to us. We don't even have a theoretical understanding of how this was done. Here we also have a block with an interesting cut in it. If you can imagine running a hot knife along a cold piece of butter, the edge of the cut is bent outward a bit. And here we see the same thing, but on a piece of granite. As I mentioned before, these technologies are completely unknown to us. So here I'll stop with the examples and state my concluding thoughts on this matter. The first conclusion is this. Are there facts which prove that in ancient times an advanced civilization left its mark on our planet? Yes, there are. Furthermore, a technologically advanced civilization which was capable of advanced machine manufacturing. There are so many traces of this. We found literally thousands of cases of signs where advanced technologies were used. So in my view, the question of was there or wasn't there some kind of a highly advanced civilization on Earth in ancient times, I consider this case to be closed. There was. The evidence exists to prove this 100%. Secondly, this overwhelming evidence dispels the most essential arguments which our current academic establishment has towards ancient myths and legends. We see that this was done by some kind of a highly advanced civilization. The capabilities of this civilization greatly surpass those of our ancestors. And so if we face the facts, then there had to have been some kind of representatives of this civilization, who, regardless of their visual appearance, were regarded as gods by our ancestors. Therefore, we have to transition away from thinking about myths and legends as mere works of fantasy and imagination, and into the realm of practical investigation. That is the second most important point, in my view. And thirdly, we can now begin talking about what kind of a civilization it was. Earth-based or extraterrestrial? But more importantly, we can try to achieve the same. If someone else did it already, then we can do it also. We have to try, if not only to make the same kinds of technologies, but at least to find their equivalent. Just imagine having access to mobile tools, and they clearly were mobile, since they worked in the mountains of Peru and Bolivia. Mobile instruments, which could cut mountains and transport them easily from one place to another. We solved the problem of building in hard-to-reach mountainous regions. We solved the question of colonizing other planets, and so on and so forth. We no longer need building materials. All we need is the technology and the tools, that's all. This is a colossal perspective to undertake. I won't go into the conclusions drawn from myths and other things, but at the very least I consider that we can now start moving in this direction. We have to move away from the argument of was there or wasn't there. We resolved this. Case closed. Let's try to understand what kind of a civilization this was, and what were its capabilities, and let's try to accomplish the same. Thank you.